It's great to see so many people who've turned up to this event, and it just shows the genuine passion and commitment there is out there to deal with media reform. I'm glad we've had such a great and varied panel. We've heard voices from abroad. I think it's important often when we're talking about these sorts of issues to remember the journalists all over the world who were victimised, who were attacked, imprisoned, and even killed in the line of scrutinising power and telling the truth about what's happening, whether it be dictatorships or conflicts like the war in Iraq, which tragically took the lives of so many journalists. I'm glad also we're hearing voices of people belonging to minority groups who've been attacked and smeared by the mainstream press, not least, of course, trans people. And I think it's so important during the debates we have about media reform that we hear voices from people belonging to groups which have been attacked in that way, and it's difficult sometimes to actually state what the consequences are and how profound they can be for people across the country, not least those who are already facing abuse and victimisation on the streets, in their workplaces and in our communities. Now, when we're talking about the press, I think it's important to make it clear that it's an absolute cornerstone of any properly functioning democracy. One of its main responsibilities, of course, is to hold power to account. But the starting point we've got to have is that we don't have a free press in this country. We have a press which is run by a very small number of politically motivated moguls who use their position, their domination of such a large swathe of the media to extract, if you like, political concessions from government to wield political influence, to have a huge role in our democracy, distorting our democracy in pretty disturbing ways. Now, if we look at the Murdoch scandal, what it did is expose the murky links between media moguls, the political establishment, and of course the police, as well as showing an absolute shocking disregard for people's privacy, including, of course, a little girl who had been murdered. And what we've seen when we're looking at the way we've got these barons wailing about Leveson, about very small and modest changes to protect people's privacy, is a huge amount of cheek. Because, of course, if we're going to talk about reform, Leveson doesn't go anywhere near in terms of challenging the power and the abuse of power that these moguls have. Now, back in the 80s, it's often seemed quite overt the way various newspapers were virtual propaganda outlets for the ruling government of the time, backing Thatcher, often when she was in very tricky situations, making sure all her opponents were as demonised as possible. But we still see that today. We still see newspapers often acting almost as outriders for the government, showing the policies in a very uncritical light and sidelining opponents of those policies. Now, I can think of one too many senior journalists who, as well as having a role as commentators, double up as speechwriters for senior politicians. Just think it through. You have senior journalists who write articles talking about a government's record and the policies they're outlining, while also helping to prepare speeches in support of those policies. That, if anything, just shows that incestuous relationship that exists between the political and the media elite. And I think what's so important, as we've been discussing, is the way we've witnessed the attacks on entire groups of people in this country. Now, one, of course, we've heard very compelling and distressing story of Lucy Meadows and other stories which are very similar. We could just go on all evening. We could talk about Muslims, for example. Now, there was one study in 2007 which just took one random sample, 1 week of newspapers, and it found, of the coverage of when Muslims appeared, 91% showed Muslim people in an entirely negative light. When they appear in the press, it's as invariably as terrorists and extremists. And that's consequences on public attitudes. If you look at the polling, it's pretty disturbing. 45% of Britons think there are too many Muslims in this country. Imagine 45% of people in a poll thought there were too many Jews in this country. And if you look at the polling of people equating Muslims with extremists, it counts as millions of people across the country. That changes from generation. The younger you are, the less likely you are to believe it. Partly because you're more likely, like myself, to grow up in schools where you're likely to mix with fellow Muslims. But if your only experience of people from that community is what you're being served up in the press, then no wonder those attitudes are so horrendous. And of course that has consequences for Muslims across the country. And we've seen a horrendous wave, a renewed wave of Islamophobia since the tragic death of Lee Rigby. You can see it, as we've talked about, with benefit recipients. Now, since this government have come to power, we've seen a deliberate attempt to redirect people's anger away from those who caused this crisis, the people at the top, to people's neighbours down the streets, the working poor against the unemployed, non-disabled people against disabled people, private sector workers against public sector workers, people living here against immigrants. And each time it's the same argument: you've been mugged, so your less deserving neighbours should be mugged as well. Now, the media have facilitated that in the most overt way imaginable, by hunting down the most extreme examples and then passing them off as though they're the tip of the iceberg, the scrounger living in a house made out of widescreen television sets with 50 feral kids running around. And of course the lowest point of this, was a few months ago, 2 months ago, after a verdict about Philpott, a horrendous monster, a misogynist, who burned down his home and killed his 6 kids. And it appeared on the front of the Daily Mail as vile product of Welfare UK, as though this horrendous murderer, this killer, said anything about benefit recipients in the way we could say Harold Shipman told us about GPs, or a man 2 years ago who killed his wife, his daughter, and burned down the house. A multi-millionaire was vile product of Millionaire UK. But this is what we see. This is what we constantly see, the hunting down of these extreme stories. And it has a political agenda, because these are journalists who are, if you like, using their role to support the government's own agenda by seeking out extreme examples to undermine public faith in the welfare state and thus build support for it being hacked to pieces. And at the same time, as Natalie spoke about, they set the parameters of what is seen as politically possible. That, if you like, the neoliberal ideas of mass privatisation, of deregulation are seen as common sense, mainstream, moderate, whilst policies which are supported, Natalie said, by the vast majority of the population are seen as wacky, out there, not to be discussed in any rational way. The fact renationalisation of the railways is so popular, it's even the preferred choice of most conservative voters, that the majority want, energy companies renationalised. There was a poll which was done a few months ago, YouGov did it. It showed nearly 60% supported a 75% tax on people earning £1 million or more, including more than 40% of Tory voters. But these are policies which a journalist would never ever, in the mainstream press or most newspapers, would never give the time of day to. It's seen as wacky, out there, extreme. And that is how they set what is seen as the possible parameters of political debate in this country.
The whole point about it is that as long as the richest 10% take liability for a small part of the liability each for the government debt, then there is no government debt anymore. You actually wipe off the national debt, and that necessarily takes the deficit down. So there's a hugely powerful moral case for this. That's why I think we got 74% of the population wanting it.
Yeah, I mean, you seem like a nice chap, but isn't this really cloud cuckoo?
Now, when we're talking about demonisation and the way entire communities are smeared and attacked in the press, that is why the NUJ's campaign and the campaign of other media reformers for a conscience clause is so important, to enable journalists to be able, without fear of dismissal, to stand up and not have to do reports or write pieces which are inaccurate, false, or indeed are found or got at through illegal means. That is why we have to support that above all else. We need also to make the campaign for unionisation. It was the smashing of the unions at Wapping and so forth in the 80s which enabled a shift in power to management, making it that much more difficult for journalists to be able to stand their corner and not be trampled on by management, again, if they were forced to do things which were immoral or illegal. Now, at the same time, what I also think we should be talking about when we're talking about media reform is the fact the media has increasingly become a closed shop for the most privileged people in society. That's because of things like the rise of the unpaid intern. Now, if you're someone who's from a relatively normal background, how on earth could you aspire to be a journalist if just to get a foot in the door you have to work for months, if not years, for free? Of course, unless you can live off the bank of mum and dad, you've got no chance. And combined with the decline of local newspapers and the emphasis on increasingly expensive postgraduate qualifications, that is why, according to the Sutton Trust, over half of the top 100 journalists are now privately educated. Just over 1 in 10 come from a comprehensive school, even though 9 out of 10 kids go to a comprehensive school. How will you ever get the issues that affect people on a daily basis fairly discussed and shown unless you have a media that actually reflects society as it actually is? Now, I think I'm positive about the direction of travel that we're seeing at the moment, because we are now genuinely having an open discussion because of the outrageous behaviour, of course, of Murdoch and so on. And as a result, I think we can make a case for media ownership, limiting the amount, as we've discussed, that people can have control of, so that they can't wield their power, their disproportionate power, by having a huge section of the media under their control. The fact now that's forced Labour to break from their devil's pact with Murdoch and actually discuss these issues, that is a huge step forward. And that means we're now pushing at an open door, which frankly, a couple of years ago, we just wouldn't have got heard. So that is important, and that's something we need to keep fighting for. And also in terms of the accuracy of the media, the way, if you like, journalists report or are able to report on what's going on in society, because of the growth of social media and citizen journalism, it potentially becomes that much harder for media to distort the reality of what's going on around us. The example I often give, before my time, before you all laugh, but during the miners' strike and the Battle of Orgreave. Now, this was a notorious battle in the miners' strike, and what happened? The BBC ran the tape in a different order to make it look like the miners had attacked the police rather than the police had charged the miners. If you had a load of people in that field with their phones, tweeting, taking pictures, distributing it, it would have been that much harder for that to be distorted in that way. And we're seeing that now with many of the protests and the way the police have behaved at many of them. That holds them to account. So I think, in terms of the issues facing us, ownership, the fact, these distortions, the lack of voices of people from minority groups and the way that helps, if you like, to have them smeared and attacked, the fact it's become a closed shop for a very small number of people, these are issues we now can stand up confidently about and win public support. That's what's changed. And I think at the end of this meeting, we don't just all go home and pat ourselves on the back and think, yeah, we've had a nice few speeches making that case, but we can actually feel emboldened that for the first time, maybe in a generation, we have an opportunity to push media reform in a way that makes it more democratic, more pluralistic, and helps, if you like, do its job to hold power to account, to tell the truth about what's going on around us. So let's take that battle on and let's make sure we win it. Thank you.